Hello guys and welcome to the video. My name is Redouane and you are tuned to photomanipulation.com. Today I thought why not break down my recent artwork process so I can give you guys an idea of how I usually make my artworks. If you are interested in photo manipulation techniques or considering a career in digital art, make sure to like and subscribe as we put 5 videos a week. Let's roll to the video. Enjoy. So today I will give you an idea of how I make my works, how I usually make my works, what's the adjustment layers I use for the lighting and the color matching. Now keep in mind I'm not going to go too deep in the details because works like this take sometimes 3 hours to 8 hours. If you want the full tutorial of this work, it's going to be included in my upcoming course, the digital landscape course updated. There you will see me doing this artwork from the beginning, from the scratch, and I will share with you my techniques that I learned in the past year. But for this video I will just show you my usual routine for making this type of matte painting or concept arts, whatever you want to call it. So let's start. First I'm going to hide all the layers and I'm going to start with the objects that I used for this scene, starting from the sky and then adding the other objects. So this is all the objects I used for this work. As you can see, there's no matching in the light or the colors. What I usually start with is fixing the values of the objects together, and the way to do that is to add hue and saturation adjustment layer at the top and decrease the saturation all the way down. And there's 3 adjustment layers I use for fixing the values. Sometimes I use the curves, sometimes levels, and sometimes I use the exposure. So what's the difference? The difference is with curves it's more advanced. You can control every point, every specific point in every specific area in the objects. And for the levels you can only adjust the midtones and the dark areas and the highlight areas. And for exposure you can do the same, but it's more easier to work with. As you can see, there's the exposure and the offset and the gamma correction. I like to use the exposure when it's a very simple object that doesn't have messy lighting on it. So first I start with the sky, and for me the sky in my works is the most important objects, because depending on the sky value I will decide the rest of the objects values. So if it's so bright, the rest of the objects will be so dark. So the sky value will control the other values of the other objects. The way how atmosphere and the value works is complicated, but I would like to use the general rule, which is the closer the object to the camera or to the human eye, the more contrasted it will be and the more details it will show, and the further the object from the human eye or the camera, the less contrast it will get and it will be affected by the sky. Less details will be shown. So here's how I fixed the values of my pieces. For the sky I used the levels to take down the midtones and the dark areas and the whites, and then I added a duplicated layer of my sky and I added contrast to it. As you can see here, it's more darkened than this. So what I did, I just duplicated the sky layer, and with the Control L using levels I made it more contrasted. So the only areas that will show is the highlights, and I changed the blender mode to screen. For my next objects I use the levels adjustment layer here too, and then with the curves I added the faded lock to it, and I did the rest for the objects here with levels, and then with curves I add faded to it. Here I use the exposure because this layer was easy to fix without adding other points, just by taking down the exposure, increasing the offset just a little bit, and the gamma correction. Offset I use it for the adding the faded lock. So let's continue with the other objects. Levels. I'm trying to catch all the layers I used for the values, because as you can see I used the same adjustment layers I use for correcting the values are the same I use for correcting the colors. So sometimes I don't know which one is for the values and which one is for the colors. Now my goal of fixing the values is to get the same objects in the same area, the same highlights value and the same dark value. As you can see, for example, this mountain with this mountain, or this rock, or this cliff with this rock, I try to give them the same light value. As you can see here, in the highlights are the same in the highlights on the rock, and the same dark levels is the same dark levels in this rock. So the idea is to get the same lighting values to the objects. Like for example, this mountain right here, if I didn't add the fade lock at the dark areas on this rock and then compare it with the dark areas or the shadows on this rock right here, so when I added the fade, as you can see, I gave them the same value of the shadows and the dark areas, so they are matching. As you can see, it's the same exact for the highlights, they got the same levels. So this is the reason why I fix the values, is just to give the objects the same values. So when you add the coloring after, you will find it will be easier to get the same colors when you got the same values. So now after fixing the values, so now we are ready to work with the color matching. So as you can see, I add the hue and saturation adjustment layer for every object to match the saturation between the objects, so there's no object more saturated than the other, sorry. Usually in my works, all the objects gets the hue and saturation decreasing. Yeah, I changed the blender mode to saturation, so the adjustment layer will only affect the saturation. Sometimes I use the vibrance instead of saturation, and as you can see, there's the saturation bar here and then the vibrance, so they don't work the same. As you can see, if you take down this vibrance all the way down, you will still get the colors right here. It's not all the way down desaturated, but for the saturation it takes all the color from the object. So yeah, sometimes when I want the hue and saturation to affect the color only, by taking down the saturation I just change the blending mode to color. So for the color it's affecting the saturation and the hues at the same times, but when you are setting it to saturation it will only affect the saturation without affecting the hues. So changing the colors will not be in a tidy way, it will be kind of complicated, not in the same routine. Like adding color balance and then adding levels and then adding curves, but it's way more complicated than that. Sometimes you need to add more than one color balance, sometimes you don't even need to use the color balance, sometimes levels is enough, sometimes one level adjustment layer is not enough, sometimes it's way too complicated. The more you get into the color matching techniques, the more it will get easier to you to understand, but as a beginner it will be so hard to understand, because sometimes you use the selective colors, sometimes you use more than 10 layers just for the color correction, sometimes you need to paint with the mouse manually to fix the some areas in the objects. But to get the full idea of how I fixed the colors in my piece, I suggest getting my course that will be ready within 3 months. But I will show you a quick breakdown on what layers I used. So for the sky I used the color balance adjustment layer set to color mode, and with the midtones I went for the blue tone in the shadows too. I don't think I touch the highlight areas. Yeah, it's just -1 and then -2 here. And for the lighting of the sky I added a color balance, but this time I tried to get the yellowish tone to the highlights. And then for the back mountain I used the levels adjustment layer, and then I added the color balance adjustment layer set to color, and I added the blue colors to it. First let me just break down the coloring and then we'll get to the atmosphere work. I used the same for this one, this mountain, levels to get the cyan and the blue tone to it, and then color balance to add the blue tone. For some objects I use the selective color at the bottom, that's to get rid of the red tone. As you can see, this mountain doesn't look red, but only because it's desaturated. If you take the saturation up, you will find that there is some red tone on it. Let me just delete that. And with the selective colors I gave it the greenish cyan look to it, and then with the color balance I added the blue tones to it, and with the levels I made it more saturated and obvious to show the blue color to it. This is the firework. Let me go up to this, and I did the same with this mountain right here at the front. Now this hue and saturation adjustment layer wasn't to take the saturation, it was to change the hues. As you can see, I set it to hue blending mode, and I took up the hues from 0 to 80. The only difference is this, that the selective color didn't do a great job with it, and it still have the red tone on it, so I did the hue and saturation to change it to cyan look, this greeny look. And then with the levels adjustment layer I took up the blues and take down the reds to give it more cyan and the blue tones to it, and with the levels adjustment layer I made it blue to match it with the other rest of the image. And then I used the level method to change the red tones to its opposite. set to hue this time, not color, because we only want to affect the hues, not the saturation and not the colors. And then with the color balance, I gave it the blue look by adding cyan and blue in both midtones and shadows. Just for the shadows, make sure to not go too far. And then with the levels, I added more saturation at the top areas, and that just by sliding the blue channels bar, just to show you that these rocks, because you know rocks reflects the color of the sky, and the color of the sky in our scene is blue, so the rocks are reflecting the color of the sky in our scene. And for some objects you will find that I duplicated the object, and that's just to fix some areas in the shadows, because as you can see here, you can see details in our objects. So what I do is I duplicate the layer, and with a clone stamp tool I sample from highlighted area, and then I paint on the shadows areas to add details to the shadows, because when you add the levels adjustment layer for the value work, as you can see before we added, there is details in the shadows, but when you add it, the details will disappear. Look here. So this is the purpose of duplicating these layers, is just to add the details back. Now again with the selective color, I changed the hues, and with the color balance I tried to add the blue tones to it, but it didn't do a good job, so I added the levels adjustment layer to make it more visible. I added a curves adjustment layer to make it more saturated. Now this is for the atmosphere, let's not get to it right now. I did the same for the rock in the front, levels set to color to add the blue color to it, and with the selective color set to color this time, I tried to get the same color in the rocks, on the rocks here, to reflect the same colors, because as you can see, you can still see the magenta look right here. So with the selective colors playing with the naturals, I just add cyans to it. And then here for the exposure, I tried to match the lighting source of both rock and mountain. And then with the levels set to color, I took down the reds and add some blues to it in the midtones, and then it didn't do the job, so I added the color balance adjustment layer and did more, and as you can see, it's getting there. If you zoomed in, there's some reds on this rock, and look at the shadow of this rock and then compare it with the shadows on this rock. This rock has blue shadows and this one has black shadows. So to fix the red areas and the shadows, I added this layers painting with a mouse by sampling the color from this rock and then painting on the areas that I want to get the same color. And for the shadows, I sampled from the shadows of this rock and painted it over these areas. I used the blend if technique. If you want to know more about the blend if technique, Abby did a video on that in our channel. Make sure to check it to see how it works, because as you can see, I got this icon right here showing you that I played with the blend if on this layer. Now let's continue to other ones. Selective colors for the hue, color balance for the colors, and then levels for the colors again. Now this two here I did at the end just for the general look. Now let's go back and break down the atmosphere works. As you can see, in every layer I add this layers set to screen and lighting, and what I do, I just add a new layer set to screen on or lighting, and with a soft brush and low flow I sample from the sky, and then I start to paint over the layer, and by clicking on P I'm choosing the brush tool, and then I use E to erase it, just to blend the objects together. Let me just delete this area right here. It's an important thing to do, because look at the difference it makes. There's a light source behind that mountain. It will give you this lens flare look when you paint over the mountain, just for realism in your work. And then I added this mist type of look just by sampling from the sky, and then using gradient tool, the transparent one, with the opacity set to 25. Just slide the gradient tool like that, and just to give it a atmosphere and depth, that's a misty look to our scene. For this layer I painted on the opposite side of the light source with a black soft brush that has a rock texture. And with the levels adjustment layer, I took down the midtones and I masked it on this area, because I want it to be dark, not too obvious in our work. And again I added a new layer and set it to lighting, and with a soft brush and low flow I just sample from the background and then paint on the areas that I want the light to come through, just for some realism, and then paint on the edges with a soft brush. I did the same here, just paint on these areas and then with A to erase. Now for the clouds, I used the technique that I covered before in our channel. It's called how to add custom clouds in your scene. Make sure to go back and watch it if you didn't already. I used that technique, so I sampled from the sky and then painted our shadow, our cloud to the scene, and then with a level adjustment layer I made it dark at the bottom, and to show it's reflecting the light I just used the same method to paint the top areas with the brush that I used to paint the cloud. Make sure to check my video on how to paint cloud so you can paint this type of realistic cloud to your scene. I don't know if it's realistic or not. And then with a soft brush sampled from the sky I just paint over the scene, and then with the eraser tool I start to remove them. And I did the same for this my rock right here. This layer is use the clone stub tool. Make sure the sample is current and below, and select the areas in the rock that you want to get back the details of, and then click on the other layer and sample from this area and then paint, just to get back the details and the shadows. And then with the exposure I just wanted to darken this area because it was so bright when I added the fire. Don't mind it. Let's go up all the way to this one. I just painted more mist in front of our objects. For this one I just got the picture of the same mountain and replaced it again here with the smaller scale. Darken it more with a soft brush and black color, and paint it on the areas that I want to darken. And then I added the color of these mountains right here to it, just to blend it with the rest of the scene, and E to erase the areas that you don't like to effect. Look at the difference it makes before painting the blue color on it. It's blending it more with the rest of the scene, so it might look like it's not doing that big of the difference, but when you finish the scene you will find out that it really makes that difference. So here I just paint more clouds. I did the same here for the getting back the details with the clone stamp tool, and I did the same as I did with this cliff. Sampled the color from this rock right here, and then painted on the edge of this rock, just to blend it with the rest of the scene. And here I painted with the mouse manually to add the colors, the cyan and blue colors on the rock right here, because as you can see it's only the adjustment layer did it only on these parts. And if you zoomed here you will find out that it's matching in some areas, but areas like that it's red and here it's all blue, so it looks fake. So what I did, I just sampled color from here and I painted on this mountain, and I used blending if to get it out of some areas. And now as you can see we got the same colors of the rocks with these ones, and look at the difference it made from completely red color. Now this rock is matching with the cliff. And please excuse my English because it's not my main language. I'm trying my best. And I painted with the soft brush sampled from the background to get less contrast on the rock shadows. Let me just take down the opacity more to 30. That makes more sense. Now I think we are done with the atmosphere painting. For this one I painted in the gap between the horse and the cliff. Because usually when you are having a character that's in front of a mist or light source, the light source usually come out through these gaps. Now I'm not sure about that, it's just a personal thing I like to do. And as you can see in the horse legs I just painted it with mouse, because in the original image it was walking on grass and I had to take the grass off. Now that we finished working on the color matching and all of that, let's go back on the fire, how I made fire. For the fire, so first let's start from the fire itself. I had this fire brush, I painted it in this different location in the cave to make it look like there's people living here and they have this fire in their caves. Yeah, so I just chose yellow color and painted it on the caves, then I masked it out from the exterior area. You got the idea. And then I added this flare look to it by just adding a soft brush, and then with a yellow color I painted over the fire. and set it to color dodge, and then I did the same again. Here I painted the reflection on the cave manually with a blending mode set to color, and then chosen the red color and painted on the areas that I thought the fire will hit in these caves. And let's leave that to the end. And then I select the caves using the quick selection tool and mask it out, and then I add a color balance adjustment layer to add the red tones to the caves, and then with the gradient map that is set to this color right here, just to give this color to the inner cave areas. And then with the exposure I made it more bright in the areas that's closer to the fire source, because you know, the closer the areas to the light source, the fire, the brighter it will get. And then I did the selective color, and then I added the reds and yellows set to color dodge. And then with the levels I did the same. I added a yellow tone because it was so reddish right here. As you can see, there's magenta coming out from this fire, so I added the levels to add the yellow instead of the magenta. And with the curves adjustment layer I just added the out areas, because at first it looked too sharp inside the caves, and I wanted to soften it by adding the exterior areas reflection. But looking at it now, right now, I kind of regret it, so I just take down the saturation just a little, sorry, the opacity just a little bit. And then with the screen I chose bending the new layer sent to screen. I chose the soft brush, set the flow to 5% or 18, just make sure the flow is on a low value, and then I sampled from the fire and then start painting over it just to add the flare look to it. I don't remember what I did with this one exactly, but I'm just going to delete it. I didn't like the red color of the fire, so I decided to change the hues. So I added a hue and saturation adjustment layer, and then I increased the hues. And that will add the yellow color to it, the yellow tone to it, sorry. And here I I duplicated the layer of this rock and then changed the blending mode to screen to get the same light source as this rocks behind it. So yeah, just change it to screen and mask it out. And I painted the shadow of the horse right here by just adding a soft brush, and with the black color I start to paint. And then I painted on the leg of the horse. I made it more dark because it has the same lighting direction as the rocks in our scene, but it was too harsh, like it was a sunlight, so I painted with a black over it to soften it. And I did the same to the leg again. I don't remember what this was. Yeah, for this one I sampled from the background and I start painting over the character, and I decreased the opacity to 50% just to make it look like it's it was far from the eyes, and to match it with this edge of the cliff right here. I don't know if it's a good idea to do that. I just like the look of it after adding it. And then let me see if I forgot anything. It looks like we covered it all. And then at the end I added a curves adjustment layer to add more contrast to the scene, and then with the color balance to add the final color grading. For the shadows I added blues and greens and then cyans, and the midtones I added blues, magenta and red. It was random right here. I didn't know what I'm doing. I just liked the final color grading. And then with the painting I used the mouse, and then I chose this brush right here. And what I do is just with a with this brush and low flow, I sample from a scene and then I start to paint over it. So let's take it to 3 and just start paint, sample and paint, sample and paint. That was just to give the concept art painting kind of look to it, because I like the feels that the picture is painted, not merged. Look at this rock right here before adding the layers, as if it was painted. And that was my goal, and I'm satisfied with the results I got. Make sure to add noise at the end. Make sure it's on 400 and then go to filter, blur, and then do blur more, and then change the blender mode to screen, and then set the opacity to 5, and it will make a huge difference. Look now, before and after. It will give it the matte painting look, because all the matte painters do this thing at the end where they add this noise to their images, because it adds the realistic look to any scene. Because when you take a photo with a camera and you zoom in on the picture, you will see the noise on it. So yeah, it's a really good idea to do. And then merge all the layers and go to sharpen, smart sharpen, and click OK to add the sharpness look to it. It will help the painting look, because when you add sharpness it will look more like it was painted. And then I added this exposure to lighten the scene a bit more. And that was it for my scene in this episode. So that was just a breakdown of this scene. If you want me to go deep on the details and explain some techniques, and maybe starting this image from the scratch from the beginning, you can get my course, and I will be including my latest artworks, and I will make new scenes too, so you can see me making the artworks from the beginning and get the full idea of how I'm changing the colors and the values in more depth and details. So yeah, stay tuned for the course. I hope you enjoyed this video. I will see you in the next one. Peace.